Nobody saw it coming when Kash Patel tried to take down Denzel Washington on national television. What seemed like just another tense congressional hearing quickly turned into a moment the nation would not forget. The atmosphere was electric, the kind of silence that settles just before something explosive happens. Cameras rolled, eyes locked forward, the air thick with anticipation. Inside the hearing room, with its polished wood panels and stage political theater, aides, lawmakers, and journalists filled every seat, waiting for sparks to fly. At the heart of the unfolding drama sat two very different men. On one side was Kash Patel, a former political aide turned media provocateur, leaning into the microphone with a smirk he did not bother hiding. Opposite him sat Denzel Washington, calm and steady, projecting quiet strength. He had not come to perform. He came to take a stand. Patel leaned forward, cleared his throat like an actor warming up, and delivered the blow. "Why don't you just go back to the zoo?" The room stopped. Not a single breath. A few aides looked up, stunned. A pen hit the floor. One person exhaled like they had been gut-punched. Denzel remained still. He did not blink, did not react. But Patel was not done. With smug confidence, he brushed imaginary lint from his jacket and pressed on, his voice taking on a syrupy arrogance. "Mr. Washington, we're here to discuss serious issues. Law, order, national values. So you'll have to excuse me if I'm struggling to understand why a Hollywood actor is sitting before this committee." He tossed out a shrug, more theater than sincerity. "Outside of your dramatic speeches and social media rants, maybe you can help me out here. Was your background in makeup and lighting, or did you specialize in social media branding before deciding to play politics?" The insult was not subtle. It was bait, a trap. Patel glanced at the cameras, playing to them now. "Some of us earned our stripes through years in national security and legal service. Others woke up famous because they threw a tantrum online." He paused for a reaction. Nothing. Just dead silence. So he pushed harder. "Tell me, Mr. Washington, what matters more to you, defending the Constitution or perfecting your online profile?" It was not a question. It was an ambush, a calculated attempt to diminish Denzel into a stereotype, just another celebrity with a microphone and no substance. But Denzel did not rush to respond. He let the silence stretch, uncomfortable, deliberate. The insult lingered until no one in the room could pretend they had not heard it. Then, without raising his voice or making a single dramatic move, Denzel leaned forward. His tone was firm, measured, and cutting. "Mr. Patel," he said, folding his hands with composure, "I understand your confusion. It's difficult to recognize integrity when you've never had to live by it." Heads began to turn. A low murmur swept through the chamber, not loud but unmistakable. The balance of the room had shifted. Denzel's tone never changed, but the temperature did. "Since you're curious about my background," he continued, steady and direct, "let me fill in what your research conveniently overlooked." He laid it out with clarity. He had earned degrees in both theater and criminal justice. While Patel had been maneuvering through political appointments and elite galas, Denzel had been walking into courtrooms, sitting with young people facing time for crimes they had not committed. He had consoled families torn apart by policy failures, mentored young men discarded by a justice system that judged their skin long before it saw their story. His eyes locked onto Patel, unwavering. "Maybe you built your reputation shaking hands in backrooms," he said. "I built mine by looking broken men in the eye, the kind no one else would fight for." A quiet ripple moved through the hearing chamber. One lawmaker gave a subtle nod. The momentum was turning. Denzel was not finished. "As for social media," he added, "I use mine to educate, to strip away the spin." He paused, letting the irony settle. Which is ironic, since some people in this room seem to have made a career out of spreading it. Patel shifted in his seat, that smirk from earlier gone. Denzel leaned forward, only slightly, and delivered the next lines with surgical precision. "You question my qualifications," he said, his voice smooth and certain. "So let's talk about them." No dramatics, no raised voice, just plain truth delivered like a closing argument. He had questioned witnesses under oath, study the law not just in textbooks, but in real rooms where decisions meant life or death. He had helped write legislation, stood in places where no one clapped, and cameras were nowhere in sight, only consequences. He paused just long enough. So let me ask you, Mr. Patel, when was the last time you cross-examined a witness, not on cable news, but in a real courtroom in front of a judge? When was the last time you stood beside someone whose life depended on justice, not ratings? The silence in the chamber was no longer awkward. It was focused, intentional. All eyes turned toward Patel. His body language shifted, if only slightly. Denzel did not let up. If this is all just performance to you, another opportunity to trade insults and sound bites, then maybe you should reread the job description. The room was no longer just an audience. It had become a jury. From somewhere in the gallery, a faint voice whispered, "Damn." It cut through the quiet like a gavel. The moment landed hard. Kash Patel glanced down. He tapped the desk once, then again. He opened his mouth, searching for something sharp to fire back, but nothing came out. Denzel calmly folded his hands. "I didn't show up for applause," he said, his voice low. "I came for the truth. If that makes me a target, so be it. I've faced worse, fought harder, and I'm still here." He let that truth settle in the air. But the silence did not hold. Patel's pride could not stand the weight. The smug grin returned, thinner now, forced. He leaned into the microphone again, a trace of bitterness beneath his words. "You know, Mr. Washington," he said with faint amusement, "it's always amusing when people parade their past around like a badge, like standing next to criminals makes you some kind of hero." He turned slightly toward the spectators, trying to reclaim the crowd. "But hey," he said, "when you've spent your career defending felons, I guess it's hard to understand what the rest of us are trying to protect." Gasps echoed softly across the room. Patel was not done. "You talk about law and integrity? Fine. Let's talk about the people you've chosen to stand up for. Assault charges, drug trafficking, robbery." He listed them like accusations, not cases. "Are they misunderstood victims too?" Patel sneered, the sarcasm thick. "Or isn't justice just easier to cry when it fits your script?" Denzel did not flinch. His expression barely changed, but his eyes narrowed. He had seen this move coming long before Patel played it. With a flourish, Patel flipped through a few printed pages and held one high, like a courtroom prop. "And then there's your social media," he said, voice rising slightly, as he held up a post calling the justice system rigged. "Theater. That's the same system you're here, claiming to respect." He paused, waiting, hoping for hesitation, for a stumble, for a crack in the composure. But Denzel leaned forward, calm, unbothered. His voice was quiet, deliberate. "Let me save you the trouble, Mr. Patel," he said evenly. "Yes, I said the system is rigged, and I stand by it." A subtle tension swept through the room. "I don't say that out of hate for the system," he continued. "I say it because I've seen it from the inside. I've watched one teenager get 15 years for carrying a small amount of drugs while someone else walks free after laundering millions." He let that truth sink in. That's not justice. That's arithmetic, based on who can afford the better lawyer. Patel's eyebrows lifted in feigned shock, but Denzel kept going without pause. "You think that makes me anti-law?" he asked, steady as stone. "I'm not against law. I'm against inequality, against a system that punishes poverty harder than it punishes crime." He leaned in slightly. "If that sounds radical to you, maybe the issue isn't with my values. Maybe it's with yours." This time, the whispers from the gallery lasted longer, deeper, the kind that signaled discomfort, not just with what had been said, but with what it revealed. Even a few panel members seemed uneasy now. Denzel turned, not to Patel, but to the room, to the people who had been silently watching. "As for those I've stood beside," he said, his voice lower but resolute, "I didn't choose them for image or convenience. I stood with them because no one else would. I defended them because they were human beings, because they had rights, because I took an oath, one I didn't trade in for likes, headlines, or a book deal." That line cut sharp. It was meant to. Across the room, Patel froze. The printed page in his hand crumpled slightly as his fingers tensed. His mouth opened to fire back, but nothing came out. The moment had shifted, and Denzel did not wait. "I don't run for my record," he said. "I wear it. Every case, every courtroom, every person I stood beside. That's what shaped me. That's what sharpened me. That's what makes me a threat to systems that depend on silence." He turned his gaze back to Patel, calm but direct. "So, if your strategy is to shame people for doing the hard work of justice, maybe you're not here to protect democracy," he said. "Maybe you're here to distract from it." This time, the ripple in the room was audible. Nods replaced glances. Murmurs turned to murmured agreements. Aides scribbled notes faster now. Something had changed. Denzel did not chase the moment. He folded his hands, his voice steady and measured, but every word hit its mark. "I've been underestimated my whole life," he said, voice unwavering. "Because of my background, because I came from a working-class family, because I speak plainly even when the truth makes people uncomfortable." He looked around the room, unflinching. "But what you fail to understand," he said, locking eyes with Patel, "is that everything you've tried to weaponize against me, my background, my voice, my fight, is exactly what qualifies me to sit in this chair." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was electric, like the room itself had stopped breathing. The first part of the battle had been fought, and the stage was set for what would come next. The hearing room buzzed with a new energy, the kind that follows a shift no one can ignore. Denzel Washington sat composed, his hands still folded, his gaze steady. Across from him, Kash Patel gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale, his once confident smirk replaced by a thin, strained line. The silence that had settled after Denzel's words was not empty. It was charged, like the air before a storm breaks. The audience, no longer passive, leaned forward, their whispers fading into a focused hush. They knew something was coming. Patel, sensing the room slipping away, made a desperate play to take back control. He leaned forward, his voice cool but laced with academic condescension. "Well, Mr. Washington," he said, forcing a thin smile, "since you've cast yourself as a champion of justice and legal nuance, why don't you walk us through the implications of a foundational legal precedent, say Marbury versus Madison, in the context of modern governance?" He paused, letting the weight of the question hang. "Or is that a little beyond your expertise?" A few eyebrows lifted in the crowd. It was a classic ambush. Drop a dense, loaded question and hope for a stumble, hope for silence, hope the other man chokes under pressure. Patel crossed his arms, already savoring what he thought was a win. But Denzel did not blink. He leaned back, casual, calm, almost amused. Then came the slow, quiet smile. Not smug, not theatrical, just confident. "You mean the 1803 decision," Denzel replied, his voice even, "where Chief Justice John Marshall established judicial review, giving the court the power to strike down laws and executive actions it deems unconstitutional?" A flicker crossed Patel's face, not a collapse, just a crack, and the room saw it. But Denzel was not finished. "Yes, it was a landmark case, but if you think it was only about power, you've missed the entire point." He leaned forward, his voice quiet but commanding. "It was about integrity, about balance, about responsibility. Marshall didn't invent authority. He earned it through reason and restraint." The energy in the room shifted again. Denzel's words landed like a gavel, precise and unyielding. "You brought it up to trap me," he said, his eyes locked on Patel, "to turn this into a law school debate. But this isn't a classroom. This is real life." He gestured subtly to the room around them. "And out here, quoting case law doesn't protect people. Understanding it does. Applying it responsibly does. I'm not here to perform. I'm here to get it right. Silence, real silence, not from tension, but from respect." Patel's jaw clenched, his hands twitched slightly, reaching for another line, but there was nothing left that would not feel small now. Denzel leaned in just slightly. "And let's be clear, Mr. Patel," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "When you throw Marbury versus Madison at me like a trivia question, hoping I'll slip, remember who you're talking to. I'm not a pundit. I'm not a talk show lawyer who never stepped into a courtroom. He paused just long enough. I've lived this. I've studied this. I've practiced this. I've stood in real courtrooms, argued real motions, fought real battles for people whose names never made the headlines. The gasp that came was not performative. It was instinctive, a shared realization rippling through the crowd. Something real had just happened. Denzel continued, his voice just a shade firmer now. And if you're going to test someone, he said, maybe don't pick the guy who spent his life answering harder questions under heavier pressure than this. Across the table, Kash Patel shrank, not dramatically, but visibly. His shoulders lowered, his confidence deflated, his carefully arranged stack of papers sat untouched. For the first time since the hearing began, he was not smiling. The audience, no longer passive, was present, engaged, awake. The balance of the room had shifted for good. The murmurs grew, first a few nods, then light applause, scattered, unsure, but it rose. Not loud, not theatrical, just real, earned, not for the spectacle, but for the precision. Denzel had not just passed the test. He had turned it around, rewritten it, and handed it back to the examiner. He let the moment breathe, his eyes moving slowly across the room, from the panel to the staffers, to the aides, and even the live stream text tucked in the corner. Every eye was on him now. Then, calmly, deliberately, he adjusted the microphone. By the way, Denzel said, his voice steady, if we're done with the pop quizzes, maybe we can talk about actual policy. A ripple of laughter broke out. Not awkward, not polite, but relieved, cathartic. But Denzel was not done. Just as the room began to settle, he leaned forward again, his eyes locking on Patel. I think the American people deserve one more truth. The air shifted again, not a mic drop, a reckoning. Patel flinched slightly. He felt it now. The power dynamic had flipped, and everyone could see it. Just minutes earlier, Patel had been steering the hearing with smug traps and academic bravado. Now he was pinned, cornered by calm logic and lived experience. His jaw clenched, his fingers tapped the desk quicker now. Then sharp, defensive, he struck back. I don't think we're here for a lecture on legal history, Patel said, his voice rising. This is about current events, real-world issues, and frankly, Mr. Washington, this isn't a courtroom. You're not trying a case. You're performing. A nervous chuckle surfaced somewhere in the back row. It landed flat, then silence, not just quiet, dense. No one laughed. No one moved. Denzel did not flinch. No smirk, no eye roll, no rebuttal. Instead, he turned slowly, not just toward Patel, but toward the entire room. You see what just happened? He said evenly. When facts failed, he changed the subject. When the question backfired, he tried to rewrite the rules. He turned back toward Patel, his gaze steady. And now, after setting the tone himself, he wants to pretend those terms don't matter. Denzel's voice grew firmer, but never loud. I didn't come here to perform, he said. I came because this responsibility matters. I was given a voice to speak for people who rarely get heard. And when I speak from truth, from research, from reality. He paused, just long enough to let it land. Because the people I represent, they deserve more than cheap insults dressed up as questions. They deserve more than sound bites packaged as policy. Patel moved to interrupt, but Denzel raised a hand, not to silence him, but to finish. You want to talk real-world issues? Denzel asked. Let's go. Let's talk about why millions still can't afford basic health care. Let's talk about the families in struggling communities, where the numbers aren't just statistics, they're lives. His voice did not rise. It deepened. Let's talk about neighborhoods drowning, not just in challenges, but in misinformation, in underfunded programs, in broken promises. Patel, still now, his once polished armor cracked, his smile gone, his eyes uncertain. Denzel did not let up. You want to call me unqualified? He said. Then let's define qualification, not by volume or elite credentials, but by results. Who's writing the legislation? Who's still in the community center when the cameras leave? Who's showing up for the people who feel invisible? The murmurs returned, but not in shock, in recognition. A hand clapped, then another, then another. Patel looked around, realizing too late he had lost the room. In a final attempt, he tried again. "This isn't about you, Mr. Washington," he said, his voice tight. Denzel looked at him, calm, unmoved, then back at the crowd. And without raising his voice, he said, "It never was." The silence that followed was not hesitation, it was agreement. Then, turning back to Patel, Denzel leaned in one last time. "You say it's all noise," he said, his voice low but ringing in the chamber. "Then maybe," he continued, stepping forward slowly, "you weren't listening. There was no flair, no theatrics, just purpose." "You're right about one thing," Denzel said. "There are rooms where decisions get made behind closed doors." He paused. "And for most of this country's history, people who look like me weren't even allowed to knock." The room froze. No coughs, no movement, just silence. "But here's what does matter," Denzel said, his voice steady. "When a mother loses her job just for staying home with her sick child. When a kid can't afford basic medication. When a grandfather works 2 jobs and still can't make rent." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of truth. "You say none of that matters? Then you've never had to live it." He turned now, not just to Patel, but to the room, the press, the aides, the interns, and the millions watching at home. "I show up because I have to. Because people who look like me don't get handed power. We survive it." Patel tried to interrupt, half raising a hand. Denzel lifted a single finger. Not to shut him down, but to finish his thought. "And here's the truth you can't spin," he said, his voice sharpened by clarity. "Every insult, every deflection, every attempt to twist my words or erase my presence, you didn't expose me. You exposed why I'm needed here." The room held its breath, waiting for the next move in a battle that had already redefined the stakes. The hearing room was no longer just a stage. It had become a crucible. The air, thick with the weight of words spoken and truths laid bare, hummed with anticipation. Denzel Washington sat tall, his presence steady, unshaken, his eyes scanning the room with a quiet resolve that commanded attention without demanding it. Across from him, Kash Patel gripped his papers, his fingers betraying a slight tremor. The confidence he had wielded so freely at the start of the hearing was gone, replaced by a brittle defiance. The audience, lawmakers, aides, journalists, and the millions watching through screens, leaned forward, sensing the final act of a confrontation that had already reshaped the room. Denzel's last words still hung in the air. "You didn't expose me. You exposed why I'm needed here." The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive, pulsing with the realization that something fundamental had shifted. Patel, cornered by logic and truth, could feel the room slipping further from his grasp. His eyes darted briefly to the cameras, then back to Denzel, searching for an angle, a lifeline. He found none, but pride, stubborn and unyielding, pushed him to try one last time. Patel leaned forward, his voice sharp, edged with a forced calm. "Mr. Washington," he said, his tone clipped, "you've made quite the speech. Very inspiring. But this isn't a movie set. This is a congressional hearing, and we're here to address facts, not feelings." He flipped through his notes, a theatrical gesture that fell flat. "You talk about truth, about justice, but let's be real. Your advocacy, your so-called fight, it's selective, isn't it? You pick the causes that fit your narrative, the ones that get you applause." He paused, his eyes narrowing, aiming for a wound. "How many of those people you claim to stand for have you actually saved? Or is it just easier to play the hero on a platform than to do the real work?" The room tensed. A few gasps slipped from a gallery, soft but sharp. Patel's words were a final gambit, a desperate attempt to paint Denzel as a performer, to reduce his presence to a scripted role. But Denzel did not flinch. His expression remained steady, his eyes locked on Patel with a clarity that cut through the noise. He let the accusation linger, let it sit in the air like a challenge waiting to be answered. Then, slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward. "Mr. Patel," Denzel said, his voice low but resonant, "you want to talk about selective? Let's talk about the selective memory of this system you claim to defend. A murmur rippled through the room, quiet but unmistakable. You ask how many people I've saved? I don't keep a tally, because justice isn't a scorecard. It's not about headlines or applause. It's about showing up day after day for the people who don't have a voice, who don't have a platform, who don't have the luxury of a microphone. His words landed with precision, each one measured, deliberate. I've stood in courtrooms for kids who didn't have a lawyer. I've sat with families who lost everything because of policies you've never had to live under. I've fought for people whose names you'll never know because they don't make for good sound bites. Patel's jaw tightened, his fingers clutching the edge of his desk. Denzel kept going, his voice steady but carrying the weight of lived experience. You call it selective? I call it human. I don't pick causes for clout. I pick them because someone has to. Because when the system fails, and it does every single day, it's not the powerful who pay the price. It's the people who can't afford to fight back. He leaned in slightly, his gaze unflinching. So tell me, Mr. Patel, when was the last time you showed up for someone who couldn't repay you with influence or a favor? When was the last time you fought for someone who wasn't a stepping stone to your next headline? The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a swell of recognition. Nods turned to murmurs, murmurs to scattered applause. A young aide in the back row clapped, then stopped, as if unsure if it was allowed. But it spread, a quiet wave of agreement that grew louder, more certain. Patel's eyes flickered, his composure cracking further. He opened his mouth to respond, but Denzel raised a hand, not to silence him, but to hold the moment. Let me make this clear, Denzel said, his voice calm but commanding. I don't do this for applause. I do it because I've seen what happens when no one shows up. I've seen what happens when power decides who's worthy and who's not. And I've made a promise, one I keep, not for cameras but for people. He turned now, not just to Patel, but to the entire room, his eyes sweeping across the faces watching him. You want facts? Here's one. The system you're defending punishes people for being poor, for being different, for being born on the wrong side of the line. And if you think pointing that out is selective, then maybe you're the one picking and choosing what truth to see. The applause grew louder now, not performative but earned. A lawmaker nodded, another scribbled furiously. The live stream text in the corner of the room ticked faster, comments flooding in from viewers across the country. Patel, for the first time, looked small, his stack of papers untouched, his smirk a distant memory. He tried to interject, his voice strained. This isn't about saving individuals, Mr. Washington. This is about policy, about the bigger picture. You're turning this into a personal crusade. Denzel's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. A personal crusade? He repeated, letting the words hang. When a mother can't afford to keep her child alive, that's not a policy debate. That's a life. When a community is left to drown in neglect, that's not a talking point. That's a failure. And when you sit there, throwing insults instead of answers, you're not defending the bigger picture. You're hiding from it. The room was no longer a jury. It was a witness. The murmurs turned to a steady hum of agreement, the kind that signals not just approval, but awakening. Denzel leaned back, his hands folded once more, his voice dropping to a quiet, resonant tone. You told me to go back to the zoo, he said, his words slow, deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. A ripple moved through the room, a collective intake of breath. So let me remind you of something. He paused, his eyes locked on Patel. We don't cage lions because they're weak. We cage them because they scare people who forgot the wild still has rules. The chamber erupted. Gasps, applause, a full standing ovation. Not for the performance, but for the truth, finally spoken, loud, unshaken, undeniable. Patel sat frozen, his smirk gone, his eyes down, no words, no comeback. Denzel turned and walked back to his seat, his stride steady, the roar of the room behind him. The moderator attempted to restore order, banging a gavel, but no one cared. The moment had already passed, and with it, Patel's credibility. This was not just a loss. It was a collapse. As the energy settled, the camera zoomed in on Denzel. He sat quietly, composed, still standing tall in his own way. He looked around the chamber one last time, not with pride, but with resolve. They say truth doesn't shout, he said softly, his voice carrying through the microphone. It stands. And today we stood. There was no speech left to give, but somehow he still spoke. This time not to the panel, not to Patel, but to everyone watching. We don't fight these battles because they're easy, he said. We fight them because we must. Because every time someone in power says your voice doesn't matter, you speak anyway. I'm not perfect. I don't have every answer. But I show up. I read. I listen. I speak for the people told to sit down, for the ones the system forgot. He turned toward the gallery, toward the interns, the aides, the young faces just now learning how power behaves. In the end, intelligence, merit, and truth always rise above arrogance and manipulation. Always. The room stood once more, not for show, but for recognition. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. As the headlines began to spin, the clips circulated, and the noise of the world returned, only one question remained. Was justice served? If you believe in standing for truth, even when it's hard, even when you're underestimated, then this moment was yours too. And if you've ever felt unheard, unseen, or dismissed, remember this. One voice, spoken clearly, can silence 100 lies. The hearing adjourned, but the echo of Denzel's words lingered, a challenge to everyone watching, a reminder that truth does not bend to power, it outlasts it.